Good morning. My name is Brian Katulis. I'm a senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy here at the Middle East Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce our webinar on the fall of Assad, the future of Syria, and a region withdrawn. Before we jump into the discussion with our excellent panelists, I just wanted to offer two notes from my own perspective. One note of gratitude and one of empathy. The gratitude goes to those of you who are joining us, but also those of you who've supported the Middle East Institute through the many years. We pride ourselves in bringing together scholars from diverse backgrounds and offering clinical, balanced analysis on a very complicated region of the world, and we're in a very complicated period of time. And as some of you may have seen, we're excited to have some changes on the horizon with a new president and CEO, Ambassador Stu Jones, joining us next year, and a new Vice President of Policy, Kenneth Pollack. So as we go through these changes, we really are grateful for your support, for those of you who work on the board and other places, and thanks for all that you do to help us do what we're doing here today. The second note, the one of empathy, is one that I think is very important to note at this time. As we delve into a complicated topic like Syria and what it means for the broader Middle East, and it's the empathy for the Syrian people. I know the country has been through a lot. Millions of families have been torn apart, not only by the conflict of the last decade plus, but by the brutal repression of the Assad regime and factors within Syria and the region. And we hope that whatever happens in this uncertain moment, it's a turn towards the future, a future that's better for the people of Syria. So let's launch into the discussion here. I'm not going to introduce the panelists at the outset. I'm just going to introduce them in turn as they speak in order of the introductory comments. The first speaker will be our colleague, Charles Listrew, who runs our Syria and counterterrorism programs here. You may or may not have seen Charles in the media or in your news clips in the newspaper over the last couple of weeks, but we're really proud to work with Charles. You've been committed to trying to help the world understand what's going on in Syria. I know it's been a tumultuous couple of weeks for you professionally and all of that. And my first question to you, Charles, is in such a fluid and dynamic situation, where do you think this transition is at today? And I should note, just earlier this week, MEI hosted a webinar, a briefing that included you and former Ambassador Ryan Crocker. And I thought it was an excellent analysis, snapshot in that period of time. That period of time happened to be just a couple of days ago, but things have moved on. What gives you hope and what gives you pause at this moment in the transition in Syria, Charles?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, it's been quite a couple of weeks. I think it's right to start by just acknowledging what an extraordinary moment this is for Syria and for Syrians. People who have lived on all sides of the various lines drawn on the map have, for the first time in decades, felt a sort of breath of potential fresh air in front of them. And I think it's really important to recognize just how momentum that is. It's been nearly 54 years since the Assad family took over. So most Syrians alive today have known nothing but the tyranny of the regime. So yeah, first off, it's an extraordinary development. Second, things are moving at a very fast pace. So just a few days ago, I was in Doha, where coincidentally, Doha became the hub of the international community's rapid response to Assad's imminent fall and then his fall and what happens next. And just a few days ago, the talk was the UN is going to launch a peace process. There's going to be a transitional governing body that's essentially formed and negotiated in Geneva, and that will be coordinated with, groups and bodies inside Syria. As I understand, there are still plans for something to be done in Geneva, but frankly speaking, that initiative is moving at 2 miles an hour, and what we're seeing take place in Damascus is at 100 miles an hour. It may not necessarily be precisely the kind of shaping up transition that the international community would want, but what we're seeing is that much of the international community is seeking to engage with that transition on the ground in an attempt, I think, first to build relationships that haven't been built with these various actors over the last few years, and then secondarily to try to shape what comes next. The fact of the matter is HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is the leading energy behind this transition. Mohammed al-Bashir, who's been the Prime Minister of HTS's Salvation Government in northwestern Syria, has been named as what he calls as the caretaker Prime Minister until March 2025. So we have basically 3 months for Syrians inside Syria primarily to negotiate what that future government, as they're calling it, the future government of Syria will look like. So we're at a very delicate phase. Yesterday, at least 6 Arab governments with missions already in Damascus had meetings with this HTS-led transitional authority, some of them with Jalani himself, some of them with Mohammed al-Bashir, this prime minister. The Italians had a meeting yesterday in Damascus with the transitional authority. The Turks are on the ground today for meetings themselves. There are open lines of communication indirectly for the US government and directly with multiple other European governments. So we're seeing a flood of sudden engagement. The complicating factor here is, of course, HTS is still a designated terrorist organization, and that presents some obvious challenges. But their behavior and rhetoric up until now has been very encouraging. It doesn't come out of nowhere, and we can perhaps come to talk about that later. Just now, an American citizen was found in Damascus, having been held for 7 months in Sednaya prison. HTS is already facilitating his transfer to American authorities, and they are apparently seeking to coordinate the hunt for Austin Tice, who is still hoped to be alive somewhere in Syria. So again, all the positive signs are there, but this is very, very early days. And I think it's just the last thing I'll say is it's important to acknowledge that despite the fact that the international community was caught very flat-footed by recent events, we do have real leverage here. The sanctions are still in place, although those will be dropped and removed with time. The real leverage we have is that we have this designation in place of HTS, and HTS is desperate to have that designation removed. And I think that gives us very significant leverage in terms of being able to provide carrots and potential sticks to influence its behavior going forward. But that's going to be a challenge, but there are already steps underway to begin that process.
Great, Charles. That's a great way to start out this conversation focused on Syria and where they're likely headed in the transition process here. I want to turn next to Wael El-Zayat, who is the CEO of Engage, a national civic education and grassroots organization for Muslim Americans. More importantly, he's affiliated with us as a senior fellow and has a lot of experience working actually in the U.S. Department of State on these issues with some top experts, Robert Ford, who's also affiliated with us, Jim Jeffries, and Samantha Power. While you're also Syrian American, Arab American, tell us about what this moment means, the opportunity that it presents, and what you hope can be done here in the transition. What's the thing that gives you the most encouragement, and then what's your biggest concern?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, the conversation about Syria has often been about the challenges and the pitfalls, and what perhaps was missing and frustrating for those of us who really knew the country was the opportunities that could occur when the country is able to get beyond the current regime. And so the question right now for Syrians and I think for the international community is, how do you seize this opportunity in spite of the challenges? The opportunities are immense. This is an important country geographically, has a large population vis-a-vis some neighbors, access to resources. It's on the Mediterranean, and everyone who knows the Syrians, they're extremely entrepreneurial, and the diaspora community all around the world, much like the Lebanese community, in fact, has done pretty well for itself and is looking to help. And so there's a lot of excitement, a lot of energy to go back, to invest, to support. Just here in the DMV area, there's so many ideas and so many people who already, by the way, showed up in Damascus the other day. Syrians on the ground are ecstatic. It's been a mix of just a surreal situation of even those of us who've been close to the issue, worked on the issue, never expected it to happen in our lifetime, especially after the disappointments. I would say after Aleppo fell and everything that has transpired since. There was hope, but to see it happen, particularly in this manner and speed, was beautifully shocking. And now, everyone is looking at what's next. And I can tell you, anecdotally, people on the ground are also looking at what HTS does. And they're hoping for the best and are also pretty impressed with what it has done so far. But they're taking note of the fact that, the prime minister and the caretaker government were appointed. And they largely represent the HTS cadre and political class. And anecdotally, I have a pre-religious mother-in-law, and the first thing she wanted to tell me was, they have pretty long beards, and although she's very supportive of transition, and so am I, they're taking note that they want to see how does this play out. Everyone is looking at actually the March date that was announced. I think if you're going to see grace and patience, I would say that's where it's going to be till. And then folks are going to want to see a pretty inclusive, representative, or at least an attempt at that. And I think for the United States, and I know we'll talk more about that, as a former official who worked on this file at the State Department and, as they say, bashed my head against the immovable object that was the Obama administration on this issue. It's about balance and not paralysis. There's a big difference here. We can observe the challenges, whether it's the designation, the sanctions, and a lot of other stuff, but the administration still has, a month to go, and a lot can happen. And so the hope from the Syrians on the ground is that there's a balanced approach, and you're seeing this, I think, from some of the countries, including the Europeans, and they're hoping the U.S. would do the same. And I'm happy to answer any questions or share any additional observations.
Sure. Thanks, Wael. We'll turn back to those questions of U.S. policy after we hear from some of our other colleagues here, and then delve into some questions and answers. And I should say to the audience that you'll have an opportunity to actually join our conversation with some of the points or questions you'd like to ask through the chat function there. Just put them up there, and we'll try to weave them into the later stages of the conversation. We started with Syria, obviously, which is where we should. And I want to turn a little bit to how Syria links with some of its neighbors and the broader region and what this means for the broader Middle East and the opportunities ahead. I'm going to turn next to our colleague Gönül Tuğ, who runs MEI's Turkey program. And hot off the presses, Gönül has a new article in Foreign Affairs I recommend to all of you, just came out yesterday, entitled How Turkey Won the Syrian Civil War. It has the subtitle, Assad's downfall is a boon for Erdogan, at least for now. Clearly, there's a lot going on, Gönül. Turkey has backed one of the different rebel groups, and there's been tensions for a long time between some of those groups and Kurds in Syria. But tell us how you see this, these dramatic historic developments, Turkey's role in it, but then also where things are now and what you see Turkey doing in the coming months as things unfold.
Well, thanks, Brian. I think that title was picked by the editors. It was way too upbeat for my taste because I think Turkey also faces significant risks. It shares a long border and very much involved in what's been happening in Syria for a long time. I know Charles and I disagree on this. I think Ankara was as surprised as everyone else by this quick toppling of the Assad regime. Turkey gave the green light to HTS, but I think they didn't really expect things to unfold so quickly. What Erdogan would have preferred, what his plan was to weaken the Assad regime enough to force him to the negotiating table. Erdogan has been trying to mend ties with Assad for a long time, since 2022 now. because he wants to repatriate send the millions of Syrian refugees back to Turkey, back to Syria. And he has been talking about another military incursion against the YPG. And when this operation was in the works in October, Turkey vetoed that plan, mainly because Turkey wanted to see first how Assad would approach his normalization efforts one last time. And I think he also wanted to discuss with Russians and others about this operation that Erdogan was planning against the YPG in northern Syria. And when he saw that Assad was not really interested in mending ties, and the Russians were quite opposed to another military incursion, Turkish incursion as well. So that's, I think, why Erdogan, that explains the timing, why Ankara gave the green light to the operation. And now I think Turkey stands to gain from this. Ankara has the most leverage over the HTS, and particularly Erdogan. Domestically too, he has two huge challenges facing him before 2028. One is the refugees. There's a huge nationalist backlash against him, and that's one of the top reasons why he lost this year's elections in the spring, the municipal elections, and that's a big deal for him. And the second problem is he cannot run according to the constitution in 2028. He cannot rerun for president. So he has been trying to cut a deal with the Kurds. But just the week when all this happened, Erdogan was saying that the Kurds and the PKK in particular were not where he wanted them to be. And now things can change in Syria, right? The Turkey-backed forces already launched an operation against the Kurds, taking some territory. So a weakened YPG will help Erdogan domestically realize his plans. And on the foreign policy front, I think the picture here is clearer because a weakened Syria is very important for Iran and Russia, and particularly for Russia. Not just Putin managed to hold the Syria card against Erdogan for a long time. So the fact that Turkey had to intervene into Syria several times and Russia controlled many things there, it made really change the relationship, the balance of relationship in Putin's favor. With that gone, I think Turkey's in that relationship, Turkey will be more emboldened. And also, Syria served an important tool in Putin's efforts to project power in places like the Mediterranean, Libya, and in the Sahel. And these are all regions where Turkey and Russia are locked in competition for influence. So Turkey will stand to benefit from that as well. And Iran also, and a weakened Iran is good news, not just for what Turkey wants to do in Syria, but also in Iraq. And that's a place where Turkey has been recalibrating its policy there in order to benefit from US withdrawal. So now, and Iranians were a big hurdle. So that is also good news. And also in the South Caucasus, where the two countries have competing interests. And I would say Turkey-US relations might be off to a good start, because especially if the Trump administration decides to withdraw from Syria, that was something that really poisoned bilateral ties. So what will happen moving forward? I think Turkey will push the HTS to include others, the groups that it has been backing for many years now. And Ankara will ask the new government to address the Kurdish autonomous region. I don't know what will happen there, but that's significant. That's very important for Erdogan. And also, Turkey said that it will take part in reconstruction efforts in Syria. And probably Turkey will try to work with Qataris too, to make sure there is enough funds and investment to make that happen. And I'll stop there.
Great, Gönül. Thanks for all those comments and articulating where Turkey's likely to go. I'm also glad that you noted where you and Charles may have a slight disagreement on things, I might turn back to that, just to stress the importance that we're all at the same think tank and we learn from each other when we have those differences of views rather than sort of collide against each other in an unconstructive way. So I might turn back to that in a bit, but we've got a lot of ground to cover. The one thing that's great about MEI is that we also have people deployed all around the region. Right now, we have a delegation that's going between Saudi Arabia and Jordan with some of our top leaders, meeting with officials. And two of our panelists on this webinar are coming from the region itself. I'm going to introduce the next one, our Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs, Nimrod Goren, who's joining us from Jerusalem. And Nimrod, it was great to see you here in DC last month. A lot has happened since we saw you here in person a little over a month ago. And what's happened in Syria has had an earthquake effect inside of Israel as well. We see on the very day that the Assad regime collapsed, Israel conducting military strikes across different sites in Syria, driven by a lot of security concerns. Also, Israel taking more advances inside of Syrian territory to create a buffer zone. Would love to hear from your perspective in Jerusalem, how Israelis are thinking about this, how the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, is trying to manage this in the context of its very assertive campaign that we've seen unfold over the last few months in Lebanon and as well in Gaza. So Nimrod, over to you on Israel.
Thank you, Brian. The people of Syria are ones that as Israelis we did not have over time a lot of interaction with, unlike people of other Arab countries. But yet seeing people celebrating freedom and having hopes for better future and optimism, that's something that is heartwarming, I think, for many Israelis to see, not necessarily the ones in the Israeli government, but within our society. And I think that's a feature that is important to remember, because we are after many months of very devastating developments in our part of town, and to see such things happen in the region, hopefully will turn things more positive. Two of the reactions that we see in Israel are kind of resembling what Gunul spoke about in Turkey. It's both the sense of surprise and happiness about the weakness of Iran, let's put it like that. The surprise it relates to what we saw after October 7, because the discourse in Israel of how could Israel be surprised with such a dramatic development happening around its borders is kind of coming back to the forefront. How could it happen again? Because the days before what happened in Syria took place, the discussion in Israel was how do we leverage the ceasefire process with Hezbollah, maybe putting pressure on Assad through other international actors to have him turn away from Iran, or to not enable Hezbollah to rearm itself. So that was a debate. I think not many people within the Israeli debate anticipated anything of these sorts happening. For the other assumption of all kind of coordination and green lights behind the scenes, but in terms of the general discourse, there was a sense of surprise. The sense of surprise was coupled with a sense of satisfaction, because the last 6 months, the events that took place vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah and the attacks in Iran and now in Syria are totally altering the strategic landscape in which Israel is at. It leads one enemy after another to either weaken or disappear. And the Syria army, as much as it was ridiculed by some, for Israelis, it's over years has been seen as the most significant mainstream conventional military threat against Israel. And with that gone, and with the open door for Iran to act within Syria and the influence of Syria on Lebanon, with all that changing compared to all, in addition to all the other things that have modified over the last few months, as an Israeli looking at strategic aspect and security, it's a totally new reality. And I think this is also reflected in what we hear from regional actors just over the last 2 weeks, and the number of times I've been hearing people from the Arab world talking about the end of the Iranian project and the beginning of an Israel-dominated era in the Middle East. That's something I didn't hear over the last year. I'm not sure whether it's exaggerated, but that's something that definitely you hear. Now, in terms of the Israeli reaction, and you mentioned how Israel acts on the ground, Israel traditionally reacts with cautious to regional changes. So any change that is happening in the Middle East, we saw it in the Arab Spring, Israel will be cautious about it. I think this cautious approach has been stepped up after October 7th. So the activism that we see now vis-a-vis possible scenarios that Israelis are afraid of is because of what happened last year. So Israel is taking action and is taking action on the buffer zone along the border in taking control of the buffer zone, taking control of the Syrian side of Mount Hermon, a very strategic point, and also doing intensive attacks to basically de-weaponize the Syrian army, which people kind of relate to 1967, the Six-Day War, when Israel last dismantled a military. But in parallel to that, there is also the discourse about opportunities. Okay, and that doesn't always happen in the Israeli debate. So officials, also within the hawkish part of our society, are identifying opportunities, are conveying messages to those taking power in Syria that Israel is open to engagement. They are, of course, also threatening from actions that will jeopardize Israel's security, but there is a hand willing to open to dialogue. And there are some who are very cautious about the fate of the Kurds and the Druze. So those Israeli politicians who over time were really dedicated to showcasing the need to protect them are now stepping up this discourse, and it fits into the Israel-Turkey tension that we may talk about later on, because I think that may change in a way as well. So that's a bit about how things are being seen in Israel these days.
Great. Thanks, Nimrod, and we'll turn back to you at a later stage in the conversation. We're getting some terrific questions in from the audience, and I'll do my best as the moderator to weave them into some other questions we wanted to ask our panelists for this webinar. Last but not least, joining us from Beirut, Lebanon, is Paul Salem, our Vice President for International Engagement. Paul is also the reason I'm at the Middle East Institute. He was the guy who pinpointed me and ensnared me in MEI, gladly so, several years ago. Give us the picture of the broader region. We've heard first from Charles and Wael a bit about what's going on inside of Syria, and then from Ghanul on Turkey, and now just Nimrod. We've not talked about the Gulf states, Iraq, but then also the broader picture landscape. Some comments we've heard already about Iran and what this means for its so-called axis of resistance. What is this transition that we've just seen unfold a few days ago inside of Syria? What does it mean for that broader regional landscape, Paul?
Well, thank you, Brian. Yeah, I am coming to you from Beirut. I'm under an Israeli drone, which are still flying around. So a very sort of precarious ceasefire, but more or less, hopefully holding, and we can get back to Lebanon in a minute. But there's no doubt this is a massive sea change in the geopolitics of this part of the Middle East. As all of my colleagues and what has been written over the past days, a really major setback for Iran after the major setback of losing the leadership and the capacity of Hezbollah. Iran could still hope to rearm and re-equip Hezbollah over time, but now having lost the Assad regime in Syria, there's really no pathway to do that. So by the fall of the Assad regime, in effect loses both Syria and Lebanon. The relationship between the Islamic Republic and Iran and the Assad regime goes back to the early 1980s. So it's a very deep and a very long relationship. It's not lost on many people in the region that whether Erdogan expected all of this to happen or not, the big regional winner so far is Turkey, and maybe Erdogan is still figuring out, what that means for him. And how that will, be translated into his regional policies. One will remember that in the initial period of the Arab Spring, Erdogan felt that the uprisings in the Arab world, the call for elections, and the victory of Muslim Brotherhood movements or Islamist movements was something that he welcomed, and he expected that perhaps in Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, and maybe Yemen, that these would all be Islamist, semi-democratic governments that would sort of be chaperoned by Turkey. None of that happened at the end of the day, but Syria was the most important arena for Turkey, and that 13, 14 years later is finally happening. Israel obviously is a big player here. I and many Syrians I've talked to have been very shaken and distressed by the Israeli attack basically on the Syrian military, which is no longer Assad's military. It's the military of, you know, the Syrian people and whoever ends up taking power in Syria. It is seen very, very negatively and in a very hostile fashion by Syrians. And the fact that Israel, without hesitation, invaded basically areas of southern Syria, took Mount Hermon and many other areas. I mean, other than the reaction of Syrians itself, I think it, you know, it sets the stage for a very negative, for two things. One, similar to the US decision to disband the Iraqi army after the fall of Saddam, which contributed to many years of a failed state in Iraq and chaos, you know, debilitating whatever state forces there were. It also pushes Syria into a higher likelihood of failed state for the next, you know, many years, which is of great concern to Syrians and many others in the region. But also, it sets whatever coalition or group takes power in Damascus very much against Israel. Certainly, they're going to be, you know, the Assad regime kind of coexisted with the occupation of the Golan Heights and only paid lip service to it. But this is a much more nationalist Islamist group. And so I fear, you know, the Israeli actions have destabilized Syria and have set Syria and maybe some of the region back into a more confrontational course with an extremely aggressive Syria. You know, in the background, or should be in the foreground of all of this, grinding devastation in Gaza, which you know, apparently sees no end in sight and fuels public opinion there. In Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, which are, you know, Gunul certainly covered Turkey very, very well. In Jordan and Lebanon in particular, there is enthusiasm about already return of refugees and the potential of the return of more refugees. And I'm in Lebanon now, and, you know, I'm encountering a lot of Syrian refugees who I come across. They can't believe it. They're overjoyed. They're making plans to go home. Of course, it's difficult. It's challenging, but they also know that the international community and others will, you know, will be available now to help. So Jordan and Lebanon certainly welcome the opening to reduce their refugee burden. Both Lebanon and Jordan have suffered for 60 years from sort of the Ba'athist regime and then the Assad regime, father and son. The Ba'ath regime really never acknowledged the legitimacy, neither of the, you know, the borders of Jordan nor the borders of Lebanon. They considered it all to be, in a Ba'athist way, part of Greater Syria, and they meddled, intervened, threatened. You know, the Syrians occupied Lebanon for a long time. They threatened Jordan multiple times. So, you know, removal of that dark shadow and that threat is certainly welcome in both capitals, along with, obviously, the, you know, obvious concern. It's only a few days in. The initial indications are not too bad, but we've seen attempts at transition after terrible tyrannical regimes have fallen in Libya or in Yemen, and obviously the pitfalls are very many, and people are very aware of the very complex situation internally among Syrians of different groups and communities and militias, but also the various regional and international armies that operate in Syria. But certainly Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq would say hope for a positive transition. In Iraq, I think it's an interesting multiple challenge. There's obviously the Kurdish concerns as to what a stronger Erdogan and Turkey will mean for the Syrian Kurds as well as the Iraqi Kurds. There's in Arab Iraq certainly an empowered Sunni community which will feel that with a sort of a Sunni reclaiming of Damascus and Syria after what they consider of 40 plus years of Ba'athist Alawi-dominated rule, you know, the Sunnis in Iraq will see how they react to this. And then among the Shia groups and parties and militias in Iraq, some are, you know, quite pro-Iranian, and others are not. And with Iran really losing both Syria and Lebanon it will likely try to double down in Iraq. But how will that affect the Shiite politics, the government's attempt to maintain and rebuild sovereignty? It will see that, Syria and Lebanon have gained some sovereignty from a weaker Iran. They would want to do the same, but Iran would want to double down on what's left of its sphere of influence there. A sort of a hanging Chad, as it were, a lingering question is obviously the Houthis in Yemen. Certainly they've remained very active on the Red Sea. Iran would not want to lose, what's left of that alliance, but we'll have to see how that develops. Let me end by saying that, the real target, as it were, of Israeli weakening of this axis and US support for it is Iran itself. And there's already been obviously a direct Israeli attack on Iran and a denuding of its, air defense mechanisms. Iran was supposed to retaliate. It has not, and probably will not. But speaking to some of the Arab envoys, again, like Charles and some of my MEI colleagues, we were at the Doha Forum, which was really quite a weekend of activities and meetings. They report, the Arab mediators, that the Iranians are very eager to talk to their Arab neighbors, very eager to figure out if they can talk to the incoming Trump administration. They certainly feel extremely vulnerable. And those, the combination of potential pressure from Israel and the Trump administration on Iran and any potential negotiations with Iran will probably determine what happens with what's left of Hezbollah. Will they disarm or not? What will the policy of Iran be in Iraq? What will be the fate of the Houthis? So in other words, a lot of what we're seeing might still be a prelude to the, as they say in the video games, the final, contest between the two big players here, which are Israel, backed by the US, and Iran, not, backed by Russia, but not really, because Russia is too busy to back anybody. But so a really changed picture. A big question mark also remains what will happen to the Russian bases, the naval base and the air base in northwestern Syria. They won't necessarily go away, and that affects what might happen in North Africa and the Sahel and others. If they do go away in some future scenario, then that in itself will have other repercussions for Russia's influence throughout the Mediterranean region. Thanks, Brian.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Paul. And those comments, I think, bring it all together for us here and touch upon some of the broader geostrategic. For me, a big strategic question at this moment in Syria's transition is whether it becomes this vortex that sucks in outside powers in an unconstructive, destructive way, or one where someone somehow can marshal support for a transition that's more hopeful for the Syrian people. What I want to do in the next phase is to thread through some of the excellent questions we're getting in from the audience, and turn and tighten our focus a little bit towards U.S. policy. Not surprisingly, I think my personal focus as senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy and a lot of what we write about, and we're about to produce 2 big papers on that Iran question and a separate one on Arab-Israel issues before Trump's inauguration. That'll be out in the next few weeks. I wanted to ask first Wael, and then have others join in, Charles and others. The basic question of how do you assess the Biden administration's response so far, and what do you think, given that the Biden team has a little bit over a month in office, how does it use this moment? And then the second part of it, obviously, is the incoming administration, which has a lot of time. And while you've served in the State Department on these various questions at previous episodes, when you and I first met personally, I believe, we had a long discussion about missed opportunities for U.S. Policy in Syria and some of the things you experienced in the front lines. How do we make sure that this is not a missed opportunity? What are the things that you'd advise, or what are you advising? I'm sure you're consulted for the team that's in there now. And then what do you say to those who are preparing to go in the Trump administration, January 20th?
Well, I mean, particularly for this team, what I said at the offset, which is, balance and not paralysis. What that means is that there are legitimate concerns, whether it's regarding HTS or the transition or even the capacity of the administration to do something in the last 30 days. But there are opportunities. And if you look right now at the question of the sanctions, the designation, those are going to take some time to unpack. In the meantime, there are needs on the ground. So the first thing that is needed is some sort of a general license for Syria that would enable the provision of not just humanitarian, but additionally, perhaps, what they call, stabilization or reconstruction or development aid, and also the facilitation of financial transaction in and outside of Syria. You got to be able to move capital in and repatriate it out, especially if you're talking about the private sector right now looking to rehabilitate some sectors of the country. And that's something that was done after the earthquake, if folks recall. It was, I think, for 6 months. And that's something that they could do sectorially right now, whether for energy or banking or any other sectors that are needed. The second piece is, I think that, and you asked me how have they done so far, I think okay in the terms of the statements. I think they've been more or less in the right place. There should be some kind of announcement of support for the Syrian people. Usually that's in the form of an aid package. We saw that for Lebanese civilians who were displaced by Israeli bombardment. And that included many Hezbollah supporters and in Hezbollah areas, right? So you have now an emergency situation in Syria, and we need to show that the American people are supporting the Syrian people in this moment of transition. That's the signal that countries that care about stability and the well-being of people would do. And I think that's something that we can. I'm not going to put a dollar figure on it, but that's something that my former boss Samantha Power could announce. The third thing is you're seeing these. I mean, my God, the images coming out of these jails, the dungeons, and the horror of this is going to be actually what my buddy Qutayba already wrote about, and others. Many are not going to be found. Syria is a mass grave site. It's a scene of the crime of the century, and so the Syrians going to need immediate technical support and help right now, whether that's the U.S. or other countries, but maybe the U.S. can support regardless. Exhuming bodies, identification, protection of evidence. Now, there are good Syrian organizations that have been doing this stuff in exile. The ICRC obviously has capacity, and they need to get in immediately. And the fourth thing is the UN. They left Damascus the moment this guy fell, and they need to come back. They need to come back for the humanitarian, for the development, and for the political piece. They have to be a part of this, even if it's not exactly what 2254 envisioned. There has to be some framework that is also internationally bound, and that benefits both the Syrians on the ground in terms of giving them legitimacy, but also keeps them honest to some degree to fulfill and to continue to fulfill at least the rhetoric that has come out of HTS and other groups. So those would be my recommendations, and really that has to transfer to the next administration. And I know it's a lot, but those are the items that come to mind.
Great, thanks, Wael. Maybe I'll turn to Charles next to delve more deeply in the next administration, and then connected to something you said in your opening remarks, Charles, about HTS. And then for Ghanul and Nimrod and Paul, if you have thoughts on this aspect of not only U.S. policy, but U.S. with partners like Turkey, Israel, other partners in the Gulf states. Charles, as you know, one great thing about working here at MEI is that we have connectivity to whomever's in which administration. I noted in one question we received from our audience members for you and Wael is, do you see the HTS accepting a pluralistic government that encompasses the various minorities in Syria? I raise that because Joel Rayburn, who reportedly is part of the Trump transition, and Joel was someone who a couple of years ago came to the region on a delegation I led to Saudi Arabia and a few other places, and he's very much engaged and has been for Syria. He tweeted earlier this week that if Jolani and HTS, a listed terrorist organization, they're delusional if they think that the world and Syria's neighbors will support his HTS-dominated Salvation government as it imposes a transitional government on all of Syria. So that's one signal we're getting from the Trump team. We got another bigger signal in Trump and Vance this past weekend, essentially saying, stay out. So do you have much hope for what Wael just said in terms of here's a very robust engagement plan that the Biden team laid out over the weekend as I saw it? Do you think the incoming team will pick this up? How do you navigate that with all of the uncertainty that often comes with President Trump?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the answer to an extent lies in looking at what the current administration is doing. So for the last 3.5 years, the Biden administration has done, well, I would say for the last 3 years, the Biden administration has done just about everything in its power not to change the equation, let alone even get properly engaged on the Syria file. I emphasize 3 years rather than 3.5 because ironically, for the last 6 months, there's been a very active track of somewhat secret negotiations in which this administration was actually considering beginning to waive sanctions away from the Syrian regime in a deal in which the regime would have been expected to start breaking its ties with Iran. So there's a somewhat irony here that we've seen a completely dramatic 180-degree shift in the US posture towards the Syrian issue in the last couple of weeks. But the shift is real. And there's very active conversations right now around engaging with potentially HTS directly or indirectly. That engagement can happen with the designation still in place, and that's already been determined. If there ever is to be a conversation around delisting, it will be strictly conditioned on a set of sequenced conditions that would need to take place. So there's no conversation around dramatically delisting HTS. That's not on the table here. I think that's important to acknowledge. But the Biden administration's actually moved quite fast behind the scenes on a lot of this. And I think the reason for that is they realize that in 6 weeks' time, everything could potentially either just be killed off and the US simply disengages. And so I think there is an effort to get a number of tracks moving that essentially cannot be reversed. That's not a US-led or US unilateral track. It is multilateral, but with some, US involvement and US guidance. And that is in terms of engaging with the transition that's happening and trying to guide it in the right directions in concert with Europeans who are already on the ground, Europeans who are seeking to engage directly now, and with the Arab states who are all on the ground. And I note that the Turks and the Qataris have got a senior high-level delegation in Damascus right now as we're speaking, and that is the track that the US is working very closely with. So Secretary Blinken was just in Ankara, as was Barbara Leaf, and a lot of that conversation is around trying to seek influence around the transition in Damascus, but it's also on a very hot issue, which is in the north of the country. And this is like a separate issue, perhaps, but we have 900 troops in northeastern Syria. ISIS is in the midst of a significant resurgence. Right now, it's on track to more than triple its attacks in Syria compared to 2023. And that was before this recent change. But with that, right now, there are violent clashes in Raqqa city between our partners, the SDF, and the local community. At the same time, as Gunul was pointing to earlier, the Turkish proxies, the Syrian National Army, just took the city of Manbij and have Kobani in their target set, the highly emotive, symbolic city of Kobani. For now, the Turks seem to be allowing this to happen, although there is an active negotiation underway with the US to come to a much greater sort of de-escalatory arrangement. But to be frank, the SDF is in an existential moment right now. This morning, under pressure, they've agreed to allow the green revolutionary flag of Syria to be flown in their territory, which is a massive concession from them. That is in large part because, ironically, perhaps, HTS has had a very constructive line of dialogue with the SDF and the autonomous administration over the last week. They've both agreed to avoid any hostilities. The SNA, the Syrian National Army, as a totally different force that does not have good relations with HTS, is a real problem here, with or without Turkish direction. And they threaten to significantly undermine what the transition wants to be, which is to reunite the country. And if there is major hostilities in the northeast, then that's very much put at risk. So the US is inserting itself into that dynamic too. General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, was on the ground 48 hours ago, and he forced our partners to disengage from territory they didn't want to leave in exchange for enforcing this recent ceasefire that's just broken down this morning. So anyway, this is all getting a little in the weeds, but it's very, very complicated, moving very fast. And I would say in the Northeast, the US is in crisis management. And in Damascus, it's in direction mode, trying to influence what's happening alongside others. And if Trump comes in and pulls the plug, then we're leaving the region, primarily the Arab states, to manage this process. And we will be departing northeastern Syria as well. And so, you know, all bets are off as to what happens from there. So it's all well and good for Joel Rayburn to be taking the hard line here. And I understand that. But that's somewhat of a problematic stance to take, given just how complicated the situation is on the ground and just how much nuance needs to be fed into how we respond to that.
Yeah, and there is that basic question of whether the incoming Trump team will invest a lot of time and resources in it. Again, the way I read the signals coming from the president-elect and the vice president-elect is very much hands-off. And I guess your assumption, Charles, and inferring from what Wallace said and others, is that sort of disengagement could actually prove to produce even more security threats and challenges in the long run rather than engaging. We have a lot of questions, and you started to get into those weeds, Charles, on HTS and things like this. I want to circle back to that in a little bit, but I want to give an opportunity. I'll turn to you, Gönül, on this question of U.S. policy, not just on Syria, but then these issues of the forces that Turkey has backed and what Turkey might do in the coming stages. You said a little bit about this, but Charles mentioned the SNA, some of these tensions. How do you think the Biden team is managing the U.S.-Turkish relationship as it relates to Syria? And then what's your expectation for when the Trump team comes in on the Turkey front?
Well, as Charles mentioned, the Turkey-backed groups captured territory from the Kurds west of the Euphrates, and now they were targeting Kobani, and Erdogan mentioned Kobani. Again, Kobani is very important for Erdogan domestically too, because Kobani really represented. This was in 2014. When Turkish Kurds took to the streets in protest of Turkey's inaction to save Kobani. And that became a turning point in Erdogan's domestic plans. So 10 years on, Erdogan finds himself at the same juncture, wanting Turkish Kurds to back his plans for 2028. And here we are, the regime is toppled. So Erdogan understands that he needs a weakened YPG to realize his domestic goals. And he might get that. Right now, I think that there's negotiations going on between the Biden administration and Ankara, but I think the real question here is what will Trump do? And I think we don't know. Yes, his instinct is to withdraw from Syria, but on the other hand, I mean, if you look at his first term and also the picks that he made for his cabinet this time around, I think it's a mixed picture. Yes, during his first term, he withdrew, made that decision. Left a small number of American troops. But on the other hand, he did things that President Obama was not willing to do. He targeted the regime after chemical attacks in 2017 and 2018, for example. Right, so and especially if we see ISIS strengthening, I think that could maybe change his calculations. But if he does withdraw, that will really leave the Kurds in a very vulnerable situation. And that is, Erdogan definitely wants the autonomous region gone.
Yeah.
And Charles said that HTS and YPG, they don't have this conflict between them, but in fact, they did have territorial conflicts in the past. They have ideological differences, obviously, but they've had sporadic clashes, particularly in areas where their zones of control were close to each other, like Aleppo or northwestern regions. So there's a lot of tension there, and we don't know where the new government will stand in terms of what the Kurds will get in the new Syria. I don't think Kurds will go back to pre-2011. but certainly they won't be able to keep their status post 2014 status either. And I think what will happen in that theater will have an impact on Turkey's relationship, Turkey's room to maneuver in Syria, but also Turkey's relationship with the US as well.
Yeah, no, and on that, before I turn to Nimrod, I should have noted when I introduced you, Gülnur, that you have a terrific new limited podcast series called Rethinking Democracy. And perhaps a subject for a future topic is how all of these issues related to freedom and progress and the potential for it in Syria right now, how that relates in the context of a Trump-Erdogan relationship in term two, because there are practical policy related questions, but then there are values-based questions that that come out here. Nimrod, I want to turn back to you, and before I go back to some of, and you, Paul, briefly, on this broader sort of policy focus, and we have a question related to Israel and its role, and then hopefully use the last few minutes to delve a little bit more deeply into the many questions we have about HTS, and maybe focus that latter part a bit more on Charles and Wael. Nimrod, there's a question from one of our audience members about, put it this way, will events in Syria embolden Israel to strike Iran again, to annex the West Bank? I would add to that mix of things because there's a lot going on in the Middle East when it comes to U.S. policy. Earlier this week, I saw some of the Biden team that is now on a trip, and they're hopeful a little bit more about getting that ceasefire in Gaza. What are these events, which, given the concerns about chemical weapons, about whether ISIS is surging and has been, as Charles mentioned earlier, what does this mean for the broader play? You mentioned a few things about this, but the likely sort of actions that the Netanyahu-led government might take in this context, do you see this as making them much more fearful and then striking out against the adversaries and trying to restore deterrence, or a bit more cautious in seeking pathways for at least interim diplomatic solutions, as we saw last month on the Lebanon front?
It gives a sense of more confidence. So I think the likelihood of those steps that were mentioned in the question is on the decrease at the moment, not only because of what happened in Syria, but for other reasons as well. You can go into that later on or another opportunity. But I would link that to answer your question on what the US can do now or later, because it relates to the question. You know, one aspect is that as we speak, there is another push by the Biden administration for a ceasefire in Gaza, maybe a limited one. But what happened in Syria should not totally divert the attention from the scene in Gaza. And we already see some international actors that are shifting the attention, partly because that's a news cycle, but partly they feel a bit disempowered to make an impact on Gaza. So it's much easier now to go to Syria and say that's the most important thing on the agenda. So that's one. The second is about preventing the Iranian comeback. Okay, if we spoke before about the weakening of Iran serving an Israeli interest, the Netanyahu government definitely wants to make sure that eventually things do not turn around, not through an Israeli strike, but probably through American action or attention or prevention of all kind of other tools that Iran can use, whether through destabilizing Jordan or going back into influence in Syria or others. So I think preventing the Iranian comeback is the second. The third is to prevent those Israeli actions of military nature that are perceived or announced as temporary by the Israeli leadership to turn long-term or even permanent. Okay, and that's a concern because we often see, and we saw it in Lebanon, we saw it in Gaza, that things that made sense from an operational point of view were later leveraged into actions motivated by political calculation, creating different things on the ground. So I think the Americans should make sure that whatever Israel does in Syria is there when it makes sense, but when it doesn't, it shifts back. And finally, on the shift between military to diplomacy. And I think that's a very big space now, because two of the countries with which Israel suffered the most in terms of bilateral relations after the war in Gaza was Turkey and Jordan. Both of them very relevant to what's happening in Syria, very important for Israel to have better coordination with them. Between Turkey and Israel, Syria was an issue that enabled engagement in the past, also from the Turkish side. We recently see some interaction between a security official that we didn't see during the year of war between Turkey and Israel. So maybe there's an opening there. Also with Jordan, I think it's important to find a way to improve the communication between the two sides. And maybe more importantly is the trilateral Israel, Lebanon, Syria, because that's a triangle that I think much more should be given attention to. On practical aspects, on sustaining the ceasefire, on moving on the land border, Shaba farms, the Gaza export to Lebanon after the lifting of the Caesar Act, etc. So a lot of attention, I think, should be given diplomatically to the regional ties of Israel, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria.
Great, thanks. So before I go back to Charles on some questions related to HTS and Wael, Paul, to you, I wanted to ask on this question of U.S. policy, but particularly the Gulf states. And there's a divergence of views, and there has been for a long while on Syria and Assad. There was a move over the last couple of years towards trying to bring the Assad regime back in and a normalization process. And as Charles alluded to it, there was, as I understand, a very right on the cusp of trying to some of these Gulf states trying to get America to lift its own sanctions and not live up to its own commitments when it relates to the Assad regime's abuses against its own people. Now, that was then, this is now. How do you see, in particular, the Gulf states repositioning themselves? What are the main differences, fault lines amongst them on this? And do you think the crucial question, which often comes up with Gulf states, is that they're looked at as the ATM, that they're going to provide a lot of the resources? Do you see that happening? And if so, in what context? What's needed there? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of the Gulf states, like most countries around the world, as Charles has said before, and I've also said the same, that they misread sort of the late period of the Syrian civil war, interpreting it as Assad has won, Assad is here to stay, he's going to get stronger, so they may as well deal with him. There was never much love lost between those Arab states or Egypt or Jordan and the Assad regime, but they also have a penchant for stability and, you know, just normalizing things as they are. Qatar obviously was in a different situation, more like Turkey, continued to be more or less supportive of rebels and not really going along fully with the normalization of Assad. I think, I mean, for particularly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, it's a very mixed bag. I think, you know, they had no love lost for Assad. They were very aware how horrible he was to his own people and his inability to even govern Syria. And so him leaving, there's no, you know, no love lost there at all. I think they both welcome a dramatic weakening of Iran. That is something that they've had been, you know, hoping for, and their engagement with Assad was for that reason, or partly for that reason, to get him more aligned with the Arab states and to reduce Iran's influence in Syria. It was a bet that wasn't going to work, but there we are. Now Iran has been weakened. That is something that they would welcome. I think their concern is a number of things. One is that obviously Turkey is a big winner. The relations between Turkey, Emirates, and Saudi are not bad at this point, but they do have different perspectives on things, and I'm sure they'd be worried what a resurgent Turkey would look like, what new ambitions would it have. We've already talked about some of them in Turkey. Would it have other ambitions in the Muslim world in general, and so on and so forth. So there's a concern there. There's a concern also that an Islamist movement has won. HTS, whether it's a bit moderate or a bit extreme, is an Islamist movement. And that's a point of concern for Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain and possibly Kuwait as well, in Jordan and Egypt. Thirdly, that this is a kind of a late feature of the Arab Spring. You know, 13, 14 years later, a rebellion has succeeded. And we know that many of those governments were, you know, quite opposed to sort of rebel uprisings, whether they were in Egypt or elsewhere. So that too is a point of concern. But, you know, having said all of that, I think they would definitely, you know, they're happy that Syria is back to the Syrians. They would hope that the transition would work well. Obviously, they would favor a Syrian you know, a transition that would bring Syria back to Syrians, not to Turks or to others, and Syria as, you know, an Arab country, an Arab regime. Certainly, there's a lot of, I think there would be a lot of interest in helping that process if it were to go in a positive direction. and to provide certain amounts of aid. Also keep in mind, in any revived Syria, and if sanctions are lifted and if basic infrastructure is being worked on, the investment opportunities in Syria and in the Syrian economy, which is completely in shambles, are also tremendous. So it's not just an ATM approach. It is something where companies and investors from the Gulf could do a lot, could also make a lot of money. They're investing in Egypt, they're investing in Morocco, they're investing all over the region where there is an opportunity. And the Syrian economy, if the transition goes well and all of that goes well, it is a tremendous opportunity. I will also say that if Syria goes well, Lebanon is likely to go well also. Both at, that would be very helpful on the political track if there is a stable Syrian inclusive political track that will reflect very well on Lebanon. And if the Syrian economy is in a revival, then the Lebanese economy, which they're sort of joined at the hip, the Syrian and Lebanese economies and the banking system in Lebanon for sure, that could be a big opportunity for the Lebanese economy as well. And
Great.
If I may, Brian, just say a couple of words on the incoming, just a few words on the incoming Trump administration.
Sure, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Israel is going to be a big priority for them. One is ending the war in Gaza, and I hope Trump will be more successful than Biden. But also the issue of annexing the West Bank that many in Trump's administration are in favor of. And maybe Trump or his team will refloat something like the Trump peace plan, which offered a kind of, patchwork Bantustan situation for the Palestinians. How will the Arab states deal with that? The other big issue that the Trump administration can't avoid is dealing with the enormous Iran question. Iran is weakened, but it is embattled, and the whole nuclear issue is more urgent than it was before. Being so vulnerable, the risk of them going towards nuclear weapons is bigger than before. And I think that's going to take a lot of the Trump administration limited bandwidth on the Middle East. And then Trump himself and his family and others, they're going to be very interested in engaging with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf for business reasons and economics and investment. So I don't think, definitely it's Trump instincts to get out of Syria, but also when you look at that, menu, Syria is not going to be high on the menu. I think the best can be hoped for that disengagement, when it happens, is managed and is not done like the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was done, and primarily to make sure that the Kurds are not, completely, vulnerable and sort of washed out by that or devastated, and also that it doesn't inadvertently, like it did to the Taliban, give a sudden and immediate gift to ISIS. So I think the U.S. will be sort of disengaging, but how it does that is something the incoming Trump administration should focus on. In Syria, obviously, U.S. support for, the process in Syria, the transition would be welcome. I don't know how much Trump will be engaged in that kind of nation-building approach, which he does not much respect anywhere.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. And as we start to wind down towards the last 5 minutes of the discussion, our colleague Gunul Tul has to leave a bit early. Just wanted to note that and thank her again for joining us before we continue with one or two more questions. For those of you tuning in, tune into her Rethinking Democracy podcast. It's terrific. She had Francis Fukuyama, a number of other voices on it, and definitely read her latest foreign affairs piece out yesterday. Thanks, Gunul. And through the magic of these webinars, she can just quietly disappear as opposed to step off the stage. I don't know if you have any last thoughts before I turn to Charles.
No, thank you so much.
Good. Charles, a lot of questions, and maybe to you and we'll see, maybe we'll close with you, though Nimrod and Paul, if you can hang by the hoop here in case you need to get back into the game. The basic question of HTS, and when I tuned into or read the transcript of the White House briefing on Sunday with a senior official, there was a lot of press questions and a lot of curiosity, some worry as well. Basic question is, how would you describe HTS's record of governance in Idlib, and what does that portend for its future behavior? Maybe related to this, and start with you, Charles, and then while you can pick up, and then we'll close out, is there are significant populations inside of Syria who seem to be scared of not only what they look like, and somebody mentioned earlier the longer beards, I think that have been observed and things like this, but what's their record? Because Syria is this diverse population of not only Arab and Kurd, but there's different Muslims and then Christians as well. So Charles, based on their record, what would you say about HTS and what you expect and how they'll govern?
So it's a really important question for obvious reasons. It's also one very hard to distill in 2 or 3 minutes. I would say, first of all, what we're dealing with here is a very conservative Islamist movement. There's no getting away from that fact. The difference that we've seen from HTS compared to its previous iterations, so it's been known as HTS since 2016, is that it no longer exerts those beliefs upon the surrounding population in a way that it did previously. Now, it's had the certain advantage until recently that it has primarily only operated in the most conservative northwestern region of Syria. So that has been a naturally more kind of advantageous context for HTS to operate in. And the test now is that it's finding itself in control of, very cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian places like Aleppo and Damascus. The rhetoric it has been disseminating to the Alawite communities, to the Christians, meetings that it has held with the Christian bishops of Aleppo, with the Alawite communities of the coast, have all sent the right signals. I think there is absolutely no question that Jolani is extraordinarily ambitious. He's also very smart and willing to be pragmatic, but he's doing this because he wants to be the kingmaker. And I think he acknowledges that maintaining that pragmatic attitude is what will allow him to potentially be the kingmaker in Syria. The challenge he will face is, I think, less from within his own group and more from what remains from the outside. Of course, as you say, yes, the minority communities who have their concerns and will speak up when they feel they need to. HTS also has the problem that it has allowed some foreign fighter groups to remain in its midst in the northwest because they have been willing to go along with this changing attitude over the last 8 years. Those groups are all now in Damascus on their victory laps, enjoying the ice cream and the souks and everything else. But Jolani, I'm told, wants them out and wants them to return to Idlib, and is struggling to convince them to do that. So it's these kind of smaller, more challenging nuances that I think actually threaten to change the equation more than HTS itself, because it is somewhat a changed organization. You asked specifically about the governance. To be frank, the governance in the northwest has been the most stable governance in any region of Syria. It's far from perfect, so I'm not sort of polishing it. But it has been the most stable. When the COVID pandemic hit, the health response was days ahead under HTS's Salvation Government compared to what we saw in Damascus or in the northeast or in northern Aleppo under the interim government. So they do have a capacity here, but whether that can extend to governing an entire country and running the economy and all of those things very much remains to be seen, and they are going to have to share power. Last thing I'll say is the fact that they've been willing to meet with, coordinate with, and collaborate with Assad's cabinet, as we saw yesterday, and they've been, each ministry from HTS's Salvation Government and the Syrian cabinet have been working together for 3 days, and I'm told very constructively, again, is all an encouraging sign. But again, that is not to polish the image of what is a very dictatorial, autocratic movement. And they're unlikely to become soft liberals anytime soon. That dictatorial tendency will remain.
So we're getting close to the witching hour where we have to close this. But Wael, if you have maybe a brief comment on this issue, not only of HTS, but then how, given the diversity of Syrian society, how to best use that pluralism towards constructive ends and what we can do to encourage that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is going to be a challenge. I think Syrians have, learned how to be self-reliant, but also tasted their freedom for the last 13 years. And they're going to want to exercise this. So I think that itself is going to keep any group that's in Damascus post-Assad honest. I really do. And you're seeing them, I think that their prime minister that they appointed, put the Hayat Tahrir Sham flag next to the FSA, next to the Free Syria flag, and people complained. The next day, he took it away. And so Just a small anecdote, but also there's the reality of the exiles. Many perfectly qualified, incredible humans left Syria under difficult circumstances, whether they were politicians, economists, cultural icons. They're going to want to have a say in what's happening in Syria. And there's that disconnect right now because they're not in charge. Many of them are going to want to come back, and they're going to have to navigate also the new Syria that perhaps they're not as connected with. I know some of them are already in Damascus and in Aleppo, and they're going to want to play a role in building the new Syria. And so
Yeah.
that's also good. How are they going to be absorbed and utilized? You know, I think that's also going to be a challenge, especially the civil society that flourished over the last decade or so. Medania is a great organization that connected so many different groups together. My God, I mean, there's so much human capital there. They're all eager to go back. And so I think that is going to be a challenge for, let's call it the temporary government that's emerging, as well as other groups in Syria, including, by the way, again, we didn't spend too much time on the Syrian Democratic Forces and what's happening in their region right now.
Yeah.
But yeah. And so my hope is that they navigate it, and that, as you know, the old dictum that we do no harm at a minimum, but also be able to support them, especially in reconciling and integrating. Anyway,
Great.
that's what's on my mind.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry we're running out of time here because it's been a really rich and enlightening discussion. Paul, something you said earlier, that if Syria goes well, then Lebanon goes well. And I think that's the hope a lot of us have, is that this moment of hope, this brief moment of hope that many Syrian people feel, that could be channeled in some sort of way into broader, more positive things. And as I mentioned at the outset, our mission here at the Middle East Institute is to help people understand sometimes very confusing and very complicated dynamics. And we'll keep doing that. And we appreciate all of you who tune in and all of those who support us. I want to thank you four gentlemen, as well as Ghanul and Absentia, for donating a lot of your time and expertise to this particular webinar. And I want to thank our team here at MEI. I want to note as I close that the audience that this recording will be posted on our website afterwards, and you could also view it or share it with others from MEI's YouTube channel. So thank you for tuning in on this. This won't be the last word we'll say on Syria, and I appreciate all your time and your attention. Have a good day. See ya.
Thanks so much.